Welcome to episode number 143 of Decentralized Revolution. I'm Aaron Harris. Nate Thurston is with me, my co-host. And tonight we've got a great guest whom I know you've been on the show at least once back before we went on my extended paternity hiatus. And I always like to go to you or Scott Horton for just a roundup of what's going on in the foreign policy world. And obviously, there's tons of stuff going on right now. So Kyle Anzalone of antiwar.com and Libertarian Institute. Before we get into all that, just tell me what's going on at each of your organizations and how everybody's doing, and just catch us up on what we should be following from those two places.
Yeah, I mean, antiwar.com is doing great where, traffic's up. People are very interested in the war issues right now, which is good to see. We got tons of great columnists and writers. So every week I do the viewpoints section. The spotlight articles, the viewpoints, the highlights, I put all that together every day. We got a great group of writers, and then we link to the best other op-eds from around, the internet. Dealing with these issues. And then our news editor is Dave DeCamp, and he's really, the cornerstone of antiwar.com. What makes antiwar.com such a great, unique website is we do news there. And so, every day Dave DeCamp is writing 4, 5, 6 news stories that we are putting up at antiwar.com. Now, the Libertarian Institute adds a little bit as like a sister site of antiwar.com, particularly in the news section. So at the Institute, I'm the news editor, and I kind of coordinate with Dave, and I write some additional foreign policy news stories, or, maybe some domestic stuff occasionally. And so the news section at the Institute is where you'll find my work. And then I'm also writing some news for judgenap.com right now. So if anybody's a subscriber to the judges stuff, you could get all my articles there. And I host 2 shows, Conflicts of Interest and the Kyle Anzalone Show.
Okay, who is the host of the Kyle Anzalone Show? No, I'm kidding. Yeah. What's the difference between the 2 shows, I guess?
So Conflicts of Interest is like more of a general news show that I do, where I kind of more just go over the articles that I write. The Kyle Anzalone Show is a relatively new project. I have a producer. It's actually the team that does the Judge Napolitano show helps me put together my show. So we got clips, guests, is much higher production. It looks better because, I'm not behind the scenes trying to do all the clicking and scrolling. And while I'm doing the show, where with the Kyle Anzalone Show, I could really offload that so I could focus a lot more. And I have on, a lot of guests. Of course, Scott Horton comes on, a lot of the crew from the Libertarian Institute, Connor Freeman, Keith Knight, Joseph Solis Mullen, Ken Silva have all been on the show. But I also get some like higher profile and cool guests too, like Daryl Cooper, Martyr Maid has been on the show. Yep. Kelly Vallejos is coming back on the show tomorrow. So it's a little bit, it goes beyond the Institute crew or just the Libertarians, and really doing in-depth foreign policy issues and on the breaking news of the day too. Like I'm usually discussing clips of what Donald Trump, whatever ridiculous thing he said, whatever day, that's what we're breaking down on the show.
Yeah. It's one of those things where with covering war and things like that unfortunately, when the news is really bad, it probably drives traffic to you guys. And so, but I'm glad that, Scott has said, it's fortuitous that they were able to get antiwar.com way back in the day. So, a good solid bunch of anti-war writers who are solid on other things are where people go. And I'm sure some traffic has been coming your way from, both Scott and Daryl Cooper being on Tucker and all that. So it's really great to see that that both Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com are there when people really need good news. That's the first place I go, because I don't trust so many sources, even sort of, non-legacy media. I don't know where to go. So it's a good jumping off point for me, both of those sites, to kind of start from a basis of, hey, I know these guys are solid. So
that was actually one of my first questions, by the way. You just mentioned that you don't trust the other sources, Aaron. Like one of the first things I wanted to know was, who can you trust when it comes to numbers on especially the Israel Hamas or Israel Gaza war, which I struggle to even call it a war. But where do you go for the information on that? Like, who should I can trust antiwar.com, and I'm like, where do they get those numbers?
Yeah, well, we're always very careful and open. One of the things that's important isn't just like saying what you think the numbers are, but why you come to that conclusion or what your sources are. And so for Gaza, you have the Gaza Health Ministry, which, people will point out that it's run by Hamas, which is fair to point out, but it's also fair to point out that in other conflicts since 2006, when Hamas has been controlling Gaza, the reported deaths from the Gaza Health Ministry has found to be accurate from international aid agencies post-conflict. And so there is an established method that the Gaza Health Ministry uses to count violent deaths during war times, and that requires bodies being brought to hospitals and morgues, and relatives saying who the people are and them identifying by their equivalent of a social security number. And so that number is 58,000. Now, it's fairly recognized that that number is low, and for a number of reasons. One, again, as I said, they only count the bodies brought to hospitals and morgues. And there's an estimated, or at least like a year ago, this is what this number is from, an estimated 10,000 bodies still beneath the rubble. And when they say that, they mean the bodies that are beneath the rubble, or those of people who are killed in Israeli no-go zones. And so Israel, kind of just draws invisible lines and says anywhere within 800 feet of this base, if you're a Palestinian, you wander in there, whether it's for food or because you're trying to get to your house or you're looking for whatever you may be doing, Israel will use lethal force and they will kill you. And this has been recorded by Israeli soldiers who have told this to Haaretz and 972 magazine, to Israeli outlets. It's been reported by some of the GHF contractors, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and these are Western contractors securing aid sites, and then some international aid agencies who have had access to Gaza over the past 21 months, that when the Israelis kill Palestinians in the middle of the area, they just leave their bodies out there, and they're attacked by packs of wild dogs and dispersed and eaten. And so there's just a lot of bodies that are now completely lost. And so the number that I think me and Dave at antiwar.com tend to put out there is one that was compiled by 99 American doctors who had all spent time treating people in Gaza. And they estimate that in October of 2024, so 9 months ago now, they estimate that the number was 118,000. And as one of the doctors, I actually interviewed him on my show. That's Dr. Feroz Sindwa. He's a longtime reader of antiwar.com. He's an American doctor, a great guy. And he said that's the absolute lowest number that they could come to. And so, that's kind of the only number that you could, I think, really point to. And of course, now you would have to say it's out of date. It's like saying 379,000 people in Yemen died during the war there, when that number was from like 2017. So of course it's gone up. Of course it's higher. I have no way to estimate it from there, though, certainly in the 6 digits.
So the term genocide gets mentioned a lot, and I've always been a little pedantic about that. And also I spent a little time in Israel a long time ago, and just from what I've read about it and different things, like, this is, maybe I'm totally wrong, so tell me, but like, I don't think the Israeli government wants to kill all the Palestinians. They just don't want them anywhere within 500 miles of what they consider to be Israel. And so that's more like an ethnic cleansing thing to me, which, if you're on the receiving end of that, I don't guess it really matters too much. But what since October 7th, and I have some actual questions about what actually happened there and the domestic political situation in Israel because of it. But like, how many people were in Gaza on October 7th and how many are there alive now, do we think?
Yeah. So, I mean, good question. The answer is unclear. There are between 2.2 and 2.3 million Palestinians. Those are the two numbers that people use on October 7th of 2023.
In Gaza or
Palestine?
Okay, in Gaza. Okay.
Yeah. Right. I think there's like 3.2 or 3.3 million Palestinians in the West Bank, and then 1.8 million Arab citizens of Israel who are the Palestinians inside the Green Line, they call it. So for Gaza, that was the number. Now, Donald Trump, since taking office, I think has thrown out like 1.8 million, which is, of course, a difference of 500,000.
Right.
Now, there are estimates that tens of thousands of Palestinians have left Gaza. The number's unclear because some of those people left by bribing Egyptian security guards to get smuggled across. I'm sure, there were probably some connections that Hamas had to maybe smuggle out some of their members or something like that as well through the Egyptian border. And then some people have been able to leave through what's called like humanitarian relief, like if you're in a U.S. prison and they let you leave because you're just that sick. And so like there's one of the former Olympic villages, or maybe it was a World Cup village or something like that in Qatar. They converted that into like a center for orphaned amputee Palestinian children. Yeah. And so like it's like the most horrific thing to look at, right? It's like a whole bunch of kids in like this like happy painted area with like, looks like lots of toys. Like it looks like the Qatari government is like providing the kids with what they need, but they're all missing limbs, and a lot of them multiple limbs, either two legs or an arm and leg or two arms. And I mean, this is what has been called the largest population of amputee children in the entire world is now the Palestinians. At one point in the war, they had estimated that I think 10,000 Palestinian children had lost a limb. And this was pretty early in the war. There's been plenty of Palestinian children who have had undergo their amputations without any anesthesia or painkillers. I mean, so, the absolute horrors there. But with that, people who maybe had long-term chronic health conditions who are able to get out, that number is estimated to be in the tens of thousands. And so, I don't know. I would guess the population of Palestinians in Gaza right now is somewhere around 2 million. But I mean, Donald Trump could have good intelligence, right? There's also been thousands. I don't think it's a 5-figure number. I think it's a 4-figure number of Palestinians who have been arrested by Israel and are being held in detention centers. And so, there's some people there too, but I'm not sure how Trump gets down to 100 or 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza unless the number of dead is staggeringly high.
Yeah. Tell me about, when Trump campaigned, Trump is all over the place all the time to me. And it looked like there was kind of a push for peace at one point, and then lots of stuff has happened since Trump took office. At any point during all that, do you think there has been was it ever close to a good result here, or to really stop this, or was that never really something Israel was going to be interested in?
Yeah, I mean, so when Trump was coming into office, the Biden administration was trying to get a ceasefire before Biden left office. But really what caused the ceasefire to happen was Steve Witkoff, Trump's personal envoy before Trump was in office, went to Tel Aviv. I think it was the Saturday before Trump was inaugurated, and told Netanyahu the president wants the ceasefire during his inauguration. And Netanyahu understood, agreed. And so, but at the time, Netanyahu and other Israeli officials, particularly Bezalel Smotrich, his finance minister, were very clear that they were agreeing to a 3-phase ceasefire. And under the first phase, half the living Israeli hostages would be freed, some Palestinian prisoners would be freed, and more aid would get into Gaza. And there are certain specifications for the kind of aid that was supposed to be allowed into Gaza. Phase 2 was supposed to see the rest of the Israeli hostages freed and the Israeli forces withdrawing completely from Gaza. And then stage 3 was the rebuilding of Gaza. Now, Israeli officials said from the very beginning that they were only going to go through phase 1 of this deal, that which was supposed to last 6 weeks, and that's what they did. So for February and for the last 2 weeks of January and in the month of February, there was a ceasefire in Gaza. More humanitarian aid was coming in during that period. However, it was still under what Israel promised under that deal. And importantly, Israel was supposed to allow in 60,000 mobile homes and 200,000 tents. This is because I think as of now, like 80% of homes in Gaza have been destroyed. And so, you have a population of 2 million people, maybe existing housing with shelters for a couple 100,000. And so that means you have well over 1 million people that are either living in tents on streets or in like rubbled buildings, right? That like are unsafe, could collapse at any moment. And so they're supposed to allow in all these tents. I think they only allowed in 20,000 tents, none of the mobile homes. And so Israel really didn't hold up its end of the bargain. The Hamas did release the Israeli hostages. Israel beat up their detainees pretty bad before letting them go. A lot of them were in just as rough a shape as the Israelis held by Hamas were. And at the beginning of March, Netanyahu didn't go back to war right away, but on March 2nd, he blocked all aid. So not even a trickle of aid was entering Gaza. Yep. And then mid-March, they went back to the bombing campaign, and that was like the official end of the ceasefire period. And so, I mean, it didn't go exactly the 6-week timeline that the Israelis said it would, but they did say they weren't going into phase 2, and the deal never reached phase 2. So I don't think it was ever a serious deal that was going to lead to an end to the conflict.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead, Nate. Yeah, you go.
I really want to know like, what's going on right now as far as the hunger, the famine. I hear people are dying from starvation. People are not dying from starvation. People are getting killed at aid trucks. And then I hear people aren't getting killed at aid trucks. And as I alluded to with my first question, I don't know what sources to go with these days. So what's actually going on with like how close are we to famine level starvation in Gaza right now?
Yeah, so for this is like famine and genocide are two words that have official meanings that mean different things than what people think of when they think of famine or when they think of genocide. And so like if you describe an ethnic cleansing by the international definition of genocide, that's a genocide. If you talk about a famine, most of the time when people think of famine, I think they're just thinking of extremely malnourished and starving children and some children starving to death. I think the ratio is actually supposed to be like 20 deaths of deprivation per day per 10,000 people. And so I can't do the math in my head real quick right here, but that would mean, a couple hundred Palestinians dying every day due to deprivation. And so I don't think there's any evidence that the numbers are actually that high in Gaza, the amount of Palestinians that are facing famine. But there is a large number of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinian children who are now at least malnourished, if not acutely malnourished. And these are the levels of starvation that are going to have lifelong implications, impact on physical ability, how tall you grow, your potential upper level IQ are all going to be limited, your brain development, you're more likely to develop mental illnesses and things like this, right? Like not feeding a child it has lifelong implications for that child. And
Yeah.
so I think if you were to call it a famine, just to, you know, a normie, it does meet that standard of famine. It does not meet like the international definitions of famine. I
Yeah.
think the international, it's like the IPFC. It's like the international classification system on food access or something like that, has all of Gaza listed in stage 5 hunger, which means that people aren't eating meals every day. Children are only eating maybe one meal a day. And a meal isn't, you know, an American plate full of food. It's certainly not the dinner that I just had. It means, you know, like a little bit of food, maybe some broth with a little bit of vegetable or something like that, and maybe some pasta. But you know, a piece of bread, cheese, I don't know, something like that. It's certainly, you know, not the definition that we would think of when we think of food. And I know, you know, people think of Palestine and particularly Gaza as an impoverished area. And certainly Gaza was before, you know, you're talking about 50% unemployment. However, there were strong social safety net systems, and there wasn't children were not malnourished in Gaza prior to this. And so all of this is a result of the Israeli imposed siege on Gaza, where so from the beginning of March until the end of May, they did not allow any aid into the strip. And so for a good part of that time, through like mid-May, soup kitchens were still serving meals once a day. Some, like the World Food Program, was still doing some small distributions of food. But at the end of middle of May, that completely ran out. And so there was a period of time where there's no aid coming into Gaza. There's no meal kitchens open. Was it the World Central Kitchen, the organization run by Chef Jose Andres? You know, he's kind of like a famous person. His agencies had to shut down because they simply had no more food. And at the end of May, Israel allowed the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is a brand new aid agency. It's not run by anybody who has any experience in distributing humanitarian aid. And Israel allowed the GHF to open 4 aid sites in Gaza. Now, one important thing before, all the different agencies, you know, World Central Kitchen, the World Food Program, UNRWA, all these different agencies had a total of 400 different meal kitchens open to feed the 2 million people of Gaza. Now they were down to 4 aid distribution sites. And, you know, every day the food was running out before people could get it. The way they distribute the food, according to, I mean, I've read probably like 15 or 20 of these testimonies from Palestinians who say basically they don't advertise when they're going to open up. So every day people just go, they leave in the middle of the night because the GHF sites are not near where the Palestinians have their tents. And of course, there's Israeli positions between where the Palestinians are living in their refugee cities versus where the GHF sites are. And so the Israeli forces are killing the Palestinians along the way. You know, you ask sources on this, and you know, I would not believe this if it was just coming from Palestinian sources. But there's an article in Haaretz, which again is an Israeli newspaper, where they talked to Israeli soldiers and Israeli officers who confirmed that the IDF was ordered to fire on Palestinian aid seekers, including with artillery shells, tanks, and drones. And so it's not as if the Palestinians just got too close to a couple Israeli soldiers and made them feel threatened. It's actually that they're firing on them with tanks and drones and things like this. It's absolutely horrific. The Gaza Health Ministry, again, is run by Hamas, so you could take the number with a grain of salt, although the Israelis are confirming, and some of the different massacres have been confirmed by different Western media outlets, like the AP, that over 1,100 Palestinians have been killed while traveling to GHF sites since the end of May until, I don't know, I think that number's from about a week ago now.
Yeah. Do Palestinians and or the aid workers or journalists in Gaza, do they even have access to the internet and stuff, for like how much, because it's basically completely controlled by Israel, everything going in and out, like are they able to get messages out? Or I'm sorry, I'm completely ignorant. I should know something like that. But what degree of freedom does information have of getting in and out of Gaza right now?
It's certainly gotten worse throughout the conflict. At the beginning of the conflict, there was internet access in Gaza. I think they started doing kind of widespread blackouts of the internet access pretty early on in the war. But due to like kind of international outcry, that's something that would be restored. Some of the aid agencies in Gaza have ways to access the internet. Like I said, I talked to Dr. Feroz Sindwa, who's an American doctor who is just in Gaza. Dr. Nick Menard, who's a British doctor, just got out of Gaza. So there are like Western agencies who have like operations in Gaza, like doing medical assistance. I think Doctors Without Borders has some field hospitals there. And so they have like kind of limited access. And so a lot of the information, a lot of the kind of journalism that you would typically see reporters doing is now being done by doctors, because they're, the Western doctors, or the Western media isn't allowed in Gaza. It's only the Western doctors are. And so, Dr. Feroz, Dr. Menard are some of the only English speakers who are able to like get in and out of Gaza and to be able to tell us what's going on. So that's how a lot of the information is getting out. Some of the cruelty is just being openly reported or bragged about by Israeli soldiers, or, Israeli soldiers will talk to Haaretz after they get out, or 972 magazine, another Israeli outlet, after they get out of Gaza. So that's where another piece of information is coming from. I read today, in fact, that one of the ways that kind of some of the local Palestinian journalists who are left in Gaza have smuggled in SIM cards with Israeli or Egyptian cell phone services. And so I guess if you're close enough to northern Gaza or Rafah, you're able to, at the right times. I'm sure it was, I lived on Lake Michigan for a time, and sometimes the cell phone service depended on like the waves of the body of water. And so I'm sure there's some of that going on. And so I've heard Gaza media say that like short video clips, text articles, or text messages are really all they're able to get out at this point in time. Yeah. Now, there's two other things going on I would mention with the journalists. One is Israel has killed, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is an international agency, 186 journalists. The Gaza Media Office reports that number is at 231. And so that's a significant number of the Palestinian journalists who have been killed, including quite a few journalists who are working with Western outlets, or outlets that are more mainstream, like Al Jazeera, a freelancer working with Dropsite News, which is run by Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm, got killed. And so, a lot of the English speaking journalists have been targeted, have been killed to prevent the message from getting out. And then just this week, we had an open letter signed by Reuters, BBC, AFP, which is like the BBC of France. And I can't remember the fourth news agency.
Was it AP?
I think I already said AP.
You said Reuters and okay.
BBC, Reuters, AP, and AFP were the four. Yeah. They signed a letter saying that their freelancers that are working in Gaza are so malnourished at this point that they simply can't work. It's writing is like mentally taxing, and so I'm sure if you haven't eaten in multiple days, to kind of like go out, document what's happening, get home, process the information, write it up is a job, right? I'm not trying to make it sound like I do like hard work, right? But for these Palestinian journalists, it really is, and so they need food to be able to do that, and since they don't have any, that's also hindering the impact of journalists. I think the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, said that Gaza's journalists were being starved into silence.
Yeah. Tell me what the domestic political situation is in Israel, because on one hand, like October 7th, what happened obviously was pretty horrible. I was actually in Taiwan when that happened. And I remember waking up and was somewhere where there was a television on. And of course I know 1% of Mandarin, and I can't read it at all. And I was so confused as to what was going on and why Hamas would do that. And then how horrible it is. And since then, anytime, defenders of Israel in, the media that I see are asked about this, they're basically saying, well, look at October 7th. We're allowed to do whatever we want, which is sometimes they explicitly say that. And sometimes it's, just implied, but they're using that as a justification for what's going on. What is that the argument that is being used in Israel? Are some Israelis not feeling that way? I know Netanyahu's got some trouble and stuff. So what is the appetite amongst Israel and their citizens for continuing this?
So there was, after Trump announced his plan for turning Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, which did explicitly call for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. He said they would be removed to refugee cities in third countries with no right of return. Right. So that was explicit ethnic cleansing. There was polling done in Israel that found that 82% of Israeli Jews did support that policy. Wow. Really, the only divide was that some people felt it was impractical to do, even though they wanted to. But just to understand the mentality, over 50% of Israeli Jews say there are no innocent people in Palestine that are in Gaza, that everyone there is Hamas. And so, there's I think pretty good consensus for Netanyahu's military operations in Gaza. Now, there is some political instability. The reservists, the members of the IDF have had to do a lot of fighting. Israel just isn't in Gaza. They're also doing a lot of military operations in the West Bank. They're occupying a large swath of southern Lebanon and also a large swath of southern Syria now. Right? Israel is a country, I think 7.3 million Israeli Jews. And so that's not a lot of people to occupy a lot of hostile territory. And so the military has been taxed, and I do think there is some dissent within the military, people not wanting to go back when they're called up for another duty and things like that. I have seen increasing reports of that. And then Netanyahu has another issue where I think, as far as I could tell, he's kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. There's an Orthodox community in Israel, and they have an exemption from Israel's general conscription law because they say it interferes with their religious practices, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's been a real push to cancel that exemption. And that's certainly increased since October 7th. And there's been so much strain on the rest of the Israeli Jewish population that is forced to conscript into the IDF. And so that seems to me to be Netanyahu's biggest political problem right now, is the issue over conscription of the ultra-Orthodox community. And doesn't necessarily have to do with the treatment of Palestinians in Gaza, or whether Israelis generally support the ethnic cleansing plan. One more thing I think that's worth pointing out here is that in December of 2022, the current Israeli government formed. There was 5 rounds of elections in Israel. Netanyahu had won some, lost some, but neither side was able to form a sustainable coalition. So the first sustainable coalition that Israel had in 3 or 4 years, the one currently led by Netanyahu, that includes Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. When that ruling coalition was formed, Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, right? This is like the American Treasury Secretary, so a high-ranking person in the government, explicitly said that he joined the coalition because Netanyahu said that they were going to annex the West Bank. And so just to get a sense for where Israeli society, the Israeli government was before October 7th, they were already moving towards territorial expansion and expulsion of the Palestinians. I just think they were going to go after the West Bank first.
Okay. Nate, you have a question?
Do you see any chances of them not continuing to move towards annexation and essentially taking over all of any of the Palestinian territory, Gaza, West Bank, all of that? I mean, whether it's this year or 10 years from now, I just don't see an appetite for them. I don't see them wanting to live next to any Palestinians. And I guess you could say also what pro-Israel side likes to say is, well, if Israel stopped right now and they just said we weren't going to do anything, well, Hamas would start attacking them, Palestinians would start attacking them. So maybe you could say Palestinians don't want to live next to them either at the same time, especially not now. But do you think there's a chance of this stopping? Or is there going to be a two-state solution?
I don't think there's any chance whatsoever of a two-state solution. This is more because of the West Bank than Gaza. Israel has bisected the West Bank a few times now. It's not a continuous block. There's settlements all over the West Bank. And a few years ago on my old show, I interviewed an Israeli who explained to me that, there used to be Israeli settlements in Gaza. And then I believe it was in 2005 that Israel did the disengagement where they pulled the Israeli Jews out of Gaza and then basically walled off the strip. And that's, how it was from 2006 all the way until 2025. That there were like multiple monuments built to like the remembrance of that event and how horrible it was and how they were never going to let that happen again. And so, somebody explained it to me years ago that there was no way you would ever get enough Israeli settlers out of the West Bank to have a Palestinian state. And so I think that the two-state solution was dead, but it has nothing to do with October 7th or what happened since then. Yeah. Now, I guess I think in a sense, the people who say if Israel ends the war now, they kind of got a real problem on their hands is right. One of the things that Israel found after October 7th was 80% of Hamas weaponry was sourced from Israeli dud munitions. So over the years, all the bombs that Israel has dropped on Gaza, I think like 10 to 20% of the bombs are estimated not to have exploded. And so Hamas got really good at, finding the strikes, breaking down the bombs. If you got a 500-pound bomb, you got a few 100 pounds of explosive in there, and then you could make that into 20, 30 rockets, some RPGs, some landmines, and things like that. Well, Israel has dropped tens and tens of thousands of bombs on Gaza. And because they've depleted their stockpiles, they've dropped some bombs from like the Vietnam era. And so the dud rate is even higher than probably 20%. I think in the New York Times said it could be like a quarter. So there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of unexploded bombs. That means like tens of thousands of pounds of explosives is in Gaza. And the Israeli government has said this. Both the Trump and Biden administration officials have said this. Hamas still has 40,000 fighters. Now, I don't think there's like 40,000 members of Hamas still in the tunnels that are like prepared to fight against the IDF right now. However, if Israel were to withdraw from Gaza and Hamas were to go back to trying to militarize, they would have an ample access of human resources and military resources to cause a major problem for Israel going forward. Yeah. And so I do think at this point in time, Israel has created a problem for themselves where I'm not saying this as a way to justify Israel conducting a genocide. Of course, they should absolutely stop right now. But within the circles of Tel Aviv and the decision making and, what the military generals are telling Netanyahu, he's effectively created a situation where they feel like they can never leave because even if Hamas goes away, right? Don't you think that, like, I can't imagine what I would do if I watched my family starve to death, if my family was crushed to death by an Israeli bomb. But I certainly know a lot of men who would go on an absolute rampage in response to that, right?
Yep.
Like, I think we could all agree that is a normal reaction of what some percentage of people are going to do if their families are killed in a cruel way. And so there's going to be a militarized resistance to Israel in Gaza. The Palestinians are allowed to stay. And so they wanted to cleanse Gaza, right? But then now they kind of have like, what can we do? We can't leave these people there because they present a threat to us because of what we did to them. Like, I'm again, this is in no way a justification. It's just an explanation for why I think Tel Aviv is going to make the decision and why they're going to feel like they have no choice when, they've had choices here all along. And so that's I think that's kind of the situation.
Is there anything I know that the thing with Starmer a couple of days ago or yesterday, like what's the international community that's not 100% behind the U.S.? Is there any hope of any of that having any effect at all?
So I didn't take this very seriously when I first read it. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, was the first one. And he said that in September, when the UN General Assembly reconvenes, France was going to vote to make Palestine a member state. Yeah. Now, I think the U.S. is still going to be able to block it at the UN Security Council because the UN Security Council has ultimate power over the United Nations, and the US has a veto and could kill anything on the UN Security Council. And so even if France and the UK, Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, said that if the war was still going on in September, then the UK would also recognize a Palestinian state. And so that would take care of 4 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, 4 of the 5 actors who could vote to veto and kill Palestinian membership into the United Nations. But that still leaves the US. And so in some ways, I do think this is just a symbolic gesture that is coming far too late, right? The 2-state solution is already dead. And so endorsing the 2-state solution now seems to do little. However, in the most unexpected of outlets, today in the American Conservative, Andrew Day has a really good article where he explains, Macron doing this could actually be somewhat significant. Now, look, ultimately, the United States is the backer that Israel needs. But if they really are excluded from the rest of the world, it is going to cause a lot of problems for Israel, particularly economically. And I'm not sure that like the not the United Nations, the European Union would get together and sanction Israel. But I think it's looking more and more likely that individual members may start really cutting business and ties with Israel. I think we'll see Spain and Ireland go first, but then other countries may follow. I mean, what is happening in Gaza right now is just absolutely horrific. There was a video posted, I believe, by one of the contractors working for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, so not a Palestinian source, and they were showing bodies of rotting Palestinians, like in awful stages of decomposition, right, that were just left there. That there's not even the slightest amount of dignity for the dead in Gaza at this point in time. It's so horrific. And, there's at this point 100 horrific things that Israel has done throughout this war. I mean, this was reported by Yuval Abraham, who's the Oscar-winning director of No Other Land and the editor of 972 magazine, an Israeli, who reported on Lavender and the Gospel, which were 2 Israeli AI programs that that essentially gave social credit scores to different places and individuals in Gaza. And if your social credit score said you were too close to Hamas, you were put on a kill list. And it gets even worse. It's not that they killed you when you were, out going about your day, maybe trying to get food or do your job or something like that. They waited until people went home. And so they were killing entire families intentionally. They actually called the program Where's Daddy? Because kids say, Where's Daddy? Where's Daddy? Where they're waiting for him to get home from work. And the thing is that when Daddy got home that day, he came home with a 500-pound Israeli bomb that blew up entire families. Recently, 972 magazine reported, this is from Israeli sources, from the IDF. This is not coming from Palestinians, the UN, anybody could be considered anti-Semitic. These are Israeli soldiers speaking to an Israeli outlet, saying that the IDF instructed its analysts to compile a list of schools in Gaza because they believe that's where Hamas members were, so they could blow them up and destroy them. They are engaging in double tap strikes. And so if they bomb a target, and in particular, it says in the story, in particular, when they don't know if the target was at the site, they'll drop a second bomb on the target. Now, why do they do that? Because let's say they think somebody is a member of Hamas and you blow up their home. Well, if they go rush to try to dig their children and their wife out of the rubble, you kill them then, right? Yep. But this is also killing the first responders or any heroic person who hears a little girl crying under a building and tries to save them. It also has the implication that now, at times first responders don't go in because an Israeli drone is hovering overhead. And so people bleed out and die who are otherwise, rescuable. Now, the U.S. did this during the global war on terrorism. However, Israel has made this policy even more sadistic. They're actually waiting until days after the strikes. So when anybody under the rubble is dead, and when people go to dig up their loved ones from the rubble of their homes to give them a proper burial, then they'll bomb the target again. Yeah. I mean, horror after horror.
And it's one of those things where I've heard when I was actually over there in 2004, I think this is true, but there were some terrorist attacks inside Israel. And, I've heard of this in other places around the world where non-state actors will do similar things. They'll have 2 bombs and wait for the ambulances to show up and set off the second bomb the whole thing is just so depressing. I mean, it sounds like a cliche or whatever that like these cycles of violence just get worse and worse and worse. And, I'm depressed just thinking about it. How do you deal with dealing with this all day? Because sometimes I will just tune out foreign policy news for like 2 months because I get too upset by it. So how do you do it?
I mean, at some point it's a job, right? Like, I don't want to sound like I don't care. Like, obviously this is something I do care a lot about, but when something is a job, you just kind of develop the ability to deal with it. And also before this, I worked first in with people who had schizophrenia, like pretty severe cases of schizophrenia. And then I worked in a therapy school. And in a way, this is like, these people had homes, they had food, they weren't being murdered walking around. And so obviously they're in better situations than the Palestinians are, but it is a little bit less personal. So I think learning how to deal with those jobs makes this, it wasn't that much of a challenge, I guess.
Yeah. And there must be a sense of, hey, at least I'm doing something to inform people about it. So I really appreciate, there's so many different people in the liberty movement who do different things. Like I've often said on this show, like I couldn't possibly be a candidate for like local office because I just can't. Like going to city council and school board meetings like sounds like just absolute hell to me. I used to do that as a newspaper reporter. And so there are people who are willing to do that. And so I appreciate guys like you and Scott and everybody at antiwar.com who can wade through some of this stuff, because it's work that needs to be done. And I'm glad there are libertarians who can do it. Tell me, and Nate, if you have any other things you want to ask about, but give us a quick Ukraine update. That's another thing where, there was a lot of hope, where Trump was like, hey, I'm going to end this thing. Where are we at, and what forces are wanting this war to continue? Why hasn't it ended?
I mean, Trump has absolutely botched this one. When he came into office, I think he had one real last chance to save Ukraine. Kiev was never going to hang on to the 4 oblasts that Russia has annexed in the Crimean Peninsula. And so had he come into office and told Zelensky that, he had 60 or 90 days to make a deal with Vladimir Putin, and then the U.S. intelligence and weapons were going to stop flowing to Ukraine, I think there was a real opportunity to end the killing in Ukraine in a way where Ukraine got to keep a portion of their sovereignty in most of their country. I think we're quickly approaching the time where that's not going to be an option, where Ukraine is going to be lucky to keep any access to the Black Sea whatsoever. I think Russia will probably take Odessa and all the way to Transnistria, which is a breakaway region of Moldova on Ukraine's western border there. And basically, at this point in time, Vladimir Putin understands the war, that this isn't a war about taking territory on the battlefield. It's a war of attrition. It's a war of trying to break the Ukrainian military. And whether that comes through bankrupting the Western treasuries that are backing Ukraine, depleting the Western arms stockpiles, and so the Ukrainians have no more ability to fight, or running the Ukrainians out of men, whichever one comes first is the way Putin is prepared to win this war. And I'm not sure how close we are to that end. The Ukrainians, I think, have fought more efficiently, better than anyone would have ever anticipated they fought, better than anyone in the West anticipated they fight. Remember, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I believe on the night of the invasion, Hillary Clinton was on with Rachel Maddow, tapping her fingers together and cackling like Mr. Burns about how we were going to give Russia and Afghanistan. And she was talking about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, right? Where Russia was going to take maybe all of Ukraine, but a large portion of Ukraine. And then they would have the neo-Nazi insurgency to fight against. Right. Yeah. That's what, after in 2015, the CIA ground branch was training Ukrainians not on how to fight a war, on how to fight insurgency tactics. Right. They were teaching them how to fight an insurgency because they were anticipating a Russian invasion and conquering of Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians have performed far better than I think anyone in Russia and Washington and any of the certainly any of the like kind of anti-war analysts like myself thought they would. And so I think we should be prepared for them to continue to find ways to continue fighting. I think the real problem that Ukraine faces at this point in time isn't necessarily money, manpower is another one. But I think that the number one is a supply of weapons, and particularly a supply of missile interceptors. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. produces about 500 Patriot interceptors a year. I think Japan produces a few too, but nowhere near the amount needed. Now, forget Israel. We just use maybe a couple hundred defending Israel from Iran, but that's not enough for the Ukrainians. And so the U.S. only has 25% of the Patriots that we need for our defense plans. Yeah. Taiwan is waiting on Patriot interceptor sales from the U.S. Germany, Switzerland, there's a huge number of countries who are waiting on these interceptors. And the West they've gotten creative. They converted a lot of air-to-air missiles into ground-fired interceptor systems. The UK just developed one. The US has developed one, I believe, with the HARM rockets. And so they've been creative and they've found ways to have interceptors. However, at some point, you run out of a supply of surplus munitions to continue to convert into weapons for the Ukrainians. And there's no more left. The Russians have really increased their drone and their missile production. And ultimately, I think that's kind of the deciding factor in this conflict, that I don't know when the end comes, but I do think what's going to happen is we'll see a fairly rapid collapse of the Ukrainian military. Maybe if the Ukrainians are lucky, Zelensky will either wake up or be removed and replaced by somebody who's willing to then make a deal to save as much of Ukraine as possible. But I mean, Russia has suggested that, if it comes to the point where the Ukrainian military collapses and Zelensky is effectively being told what to write and to sign on the dotted line at the barrel of a Russian gun, Russia is going to take 8 oblasts from Ukraine, like half the country. I mean, Ukraine could be left as like essentially a neo-Nazi rump state. And I'm sure Russia will carry out a lot of revenge killings and do a lot of horrific things to the Ukrainian people once they've effectively conquered and controlled the territory. So I'm really concerned that this war is going to end really, really, really badly for the Ukrainians. And the United States, rather than doing everything we can now to say to the Ukrainians, hey, you really did a good job weakening Russia for us. This is what we wanted to happen. But now we're going to bail you guys out. We're going to negotiate an end to this war. We'll leverage the frozen Russian assets. We'll move some of our missile bases out of Eastern Europe. We'll take the German permanent military installation out of Lithuania and stop war games right on the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea that really upset Russia. We'll make some concessions to the Kremlin in order to get you a better deal. There's no sign that that's going to happen, and that Trump has really been tricked in 2 ways. One, he's being told that the Europeans are going to pay for these weapons, which isn't sure is true. And the second one is this minerals deal, where it seems to me that the deal is Ukraine is going to form mining companies and then give Americans a 50% stake in those mining companies. And then they're going to get credit to buy U.S. weapons in exchange for the stake in that company. The problem is who knows how many of these mines end up in Ukrainian territory at the end of this war. Ukraine is a notoriously corrupt country. How many of these mines are already mined out or sold to somebody else? Yeah. I see this being as a real scam to give Ukraine some fictional credit from the U.S. to buy some weapons, and we'll never see any return on it.
Yeah. I was actually optimistic about the weapons deal. Not optimistic like I want it to happen, but I was like, hey, at least it's different from when Biden was in office. We're just giving them these things, and then the other thing they were doing, which was valuing those at what we paid for them in 1995 and not what we were going to have to pay to replace them, But it seemed like in this weapons deal with Europe that they were going to be paying full price for new weapons. Is that not going to be the case?
So it kind of remains to be seen. I do think the Europeans are going to pay for a chunk of American weapons to be sent to Ukraine. I doubt it's going to be $10 billion. The French, the Italians, the Hungarians, and the Slovaks, I think, have all said that they're not going to participate in this program. The Spanish have no money. So I'm sure there's quite a few other countries. Germany and the UK will probably finance it to some extent. Poland's already spending 4% of GDP on military, and there's some Warsaw isn't necessarily happy with Kiev for a number of kind of localized trade regions and the way that the Ukrainians treat some of the Polish in Ukraine. And so I'm not sure that there's really that much money to go around in NATO to end up buying $10 billion of U.S. weapons. Now, Thank you. You're one of the first people I have ever heard, other than myself, mention the scam that the Biden administration used to free up more funds to send the weapons to Ukraine, where they were using, like you said, the valuations from when they initially bought the weapons, or I think in some cases they were saying, oh, this military hardware has been used in like Iraq, so it's worth less.
Yeah.
And sure, the value of that Humvee isn't worth whatever a new one is, but the presidential drawdown authority funds that you're using to send the weapons to Ukraine is appropriated by Congress to buy new weapons to replace the old weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really did. I'm sure, I bet if Americans could see it, they would be horrified to learn how much the Biden administration depleted American weapons stockpiles with no ability to replenish it. It really remains to be seen whether at some point Trump's going to go to Congress and ask for another massive spending bill. I think the Biden administration left them like $3.3 billion. It seems like, I'm not sure of this. I've asked the State Department. I haven't gotten an answer yet, that the Pentagon funded a $50 million sale of their modules for drones that turn drones into AI powered systems. And so they're a little bit more impervious to electronic warfare and jamming, because they don't need like the signal back to the operator to continue to work. They could fly and operate on their own. And so I think the US under Trump spent $50 million on that. And then we recently approved about $652 million in arms sales to Ukraine. And it's unclear of how that's going to be paid for. Again, I asked the State Department. I just haven't heard back yet.
I think I might have tried a scheme like that with my wife and say, hey, I'm going to donate a $500 guitar, and I have to replace it with a $3,500 guitar.
Yeah.
And look at me, aren't I? Well, meanwhile, the guy at the guitar store is the real winner on that. Anything else, Nate, that you want to ask Kyle about while we have his encyclopedic up to the minute knowledge on stuff? Or
it wasn't really on the Russia-Ukraine thing. Back on the Israel-Gaza thing, last thing I was trying to end with something maybe positive, which is, I don't know if I'm right about this, but I feel like the mood is shifting a bit in the U.S. I did see a recent story about Gallup polls saying that 32% of Americans approve of Israel's war. And you got people like Marjorie Taylor Greene that are actually coming out using the word genocide and having her NDAA amendment now only got 6 votes. But, I feel like we're seeing more things in pop culture, not just from the hardcore left or from the... So I was actually going to use woke right in a sentence, but I decided that'd be ridiculous. Not woke right. Not just from the hardcore left people, but it's starting to really come into popular culture at the moment. Am I wrong on that, or is that actually happening?
No, you're right. And I think importantly, the younger, like kind of MAGA leaning MAGA American firsters that maybe lean Republican. I don't want to call them Republicans. I don't want to necessarily call them MAGA. Maybe American firsters is the best term. The Cassandra McDonalds of the world are very much against this policy. And as far as I could tell, these people are the best users of social media and the ones I think who get to like drive the narrative in the discussion a little bit. And so I do think it's really important. I saw a poll at one point, 50% of Republicans under the age of 50 do not want the U.S. to give the level of support to Israel that they're giving Israel. And so I do think that that's a good sign. Now, I think the problem is that Netanyahu can also read these polls, and he knows that maybe the Israeli lobby's control. I think it was Pat Buchanan who said Capitol Hill is occupied territory, right? That is only going to exist for a limited time. Right now, unfortunately, most members of Congress at this point in time end up in their congressional seat, even after they're in the dementia ward of a nursing home. right? It's absolutely unbelievable, but that really is the case. And so even if the American people shift, I think it's going to take some time for a real change to come in the US government. I mean, even in Trump's administration, even the realists, even the people who are supposed to be better on foreign policy, like Tulsi Gabbard, are fairly firmly in the Zionist camp, right? Danny Davis, retired Lieutenant Colonel Danny Davis. If you watch the show Danny Davis Deep Dive, it's absolutely fantastic. He was an Afghan war whistleblower, and he was supposed to work in the Trump administration under Tulsi Gabbard, and the Israel lobby vetoed it, and he didn't get the job, right? So Israel still, the Israel lobby, the mostly Christian Zionists is not, I'm not calling it the Jewish lobby, right? It's a lot of Christian Zionists here in the United States, like the Mike Huckabee types, who think that Israel needs to become greater Israel, knock down the Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuild the third temple for their own like kind of apocalyptic end time second coming of Christ that they want to usher in.
Yeah.
And so this is a deeply entrenched policy in Washington, D.C. And I'm not like, if it becomes a 70% issue with Americans against giving support to Israel, I'm not sure that's going to be enough to change the situation in Washington. Yeah. So the good news is I think the narrative and the discussion is changing among Americans. You know, you got Marjorie Taylor Greene, Candace Owens, Miss Rachel, all like really telling their followers like, hey, this is bad. We don't want to be a part of this anymore. We have to feed these starving people in Gaza. And I think all of that is fantastic and moving in the right direction. I certainly don't think it's going to move the U.S. in the right direction fast enough to save Gaza. Yeah. And I think Netanyahu and his coalition understand that they have to move on annexing the West Bank. And they've taken some serious steps towards that in the background in the past year. The Knesset passed a bill, and they're working on legislation that will give Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who's a settler himself, the ability to essentially invalidate anybody's property deed. Yeah. And so this means that, you know, he could go to an entire Palestinian village and say, all that paperwork that you says that you own that house, that you own that property, worthless, trash, burn it. We don't care. And then he could give the property out to whoever he wants. Yeah. And so this is, I think, really set. And he would be able to, I don't think it would be officially declaring parts of Area C of the West Bank, which is 60% of the West Bank, as Israeli territory, but it would be territory that is put under control of the Israeli government. So a de facto annexation.
Well, the whole thing, like you're talking about, the public opinion in the U.S. shifting, it could be 80-20. But it's public choice theory, like one well-organized minority fighting for their one, slice of the pie is going to have an outsized effect over 80% of the people who, they may be against what's going on in Gaza, but it's not one of their top 10 issues. And, they're not going to, who else are they going to vote for and all that? So, so we know AIPAC is a thing. Thomas Massey has told us about that. Ron Paul, his experience in Congress. So we know that's a thing. But one thing we do know for a fact is that, nobody on the Epstein list has anything to do with what is going on in Israel or Gaza, right? We know that for a fact because people have told us that there is no list, and that's depressing. There's also a joke in there somewhere about Jeffrey Epstein retiring to the Gaza Riviera or whatever. I don't know if I believe that story that he's still alive, but I do know that there's some connection there. But
just had to bring up Epstein.
I don't know why anybody would get phase 1 of the Epstein files and assume that there would be a phase 2.
Right.
That's just crazy.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. You got to laugh to keep from crying.
That's right.
Hey Kyle, I really appreciate it. Keep doing the good work you're doing.
Thank you.
And we'll. I think a listener emailed me a bit ago to get Joseph Solis Mullen back on. A former co-host had him on like 3 years ago on the show.
Joe's great.
So, yeah, I'm gonna reach out to him soon. So, and anybody else, I may pick your brain for guests on other foreign policy guests other than Scott, whom we'll have back on at some point too. But I know he's been pretty busy lately, and check out his Provoked podcast with Daryl Cooper, which is great.
Yep.
I appreciate you coming in kind of on short notice for us this week and doing a great job as always. So we'll see you, Kyle. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. Anytime.
Okay. Thanks, Nate. We'll see you next week. Actually, we won't see Nate next week. He's going to be on vacation a couple weeks. We've got a big guest coming up late August that I'll tell you about soon, and all that. But you've been doing a great job, Nate, and
Thank you.
I'll see you back in 3 weeks. Okay.
All right, man.
All right. See you. Bye-bye.